Any aircraft. Any aircraft. 12 men. 2 minutes. The words came through static. Flat. Controlled. The kind of voice that had already made its peace and was now asking for a miracle anyway. There was no answer for 3 full seconds. 3 seconds is nothing in ordinary life. 3 seconds is the time it takes to pour a cup of coffee, to check a watch and look away, to decide whether the weather is good enough for a walk. 3 seconds in a radio channel where 12 men are surrounded by 200 fighters is an eternity. And then a voice answered. Steady, certain, female. What happened in the next 8 minutes would be studied in military classrooms for years. What led to those 8 minutes took a lifetime to build. And the full weight of what it cost the machine, the mission, the woman inside the cockpit, that part was never in any official report. This is the story they classified. The story that stayed locked in a filing cabinet for a decade while the woman at the center of it went on teaching other pilots how to fly toward what should have been impossible. Her name was Captain Kate Mercer. She was 28 years old. She had sandy blonde hair tucked regulation tight beneath her helmet green eyes that other pilots described as almost unsettling in their stillness, and a runner's build that made her look on the ground like someone who belonged at a university rather than in the cockpit of the most brutally effective close air support aircraft the United States had ever built. She was not the loudest pilot on the base. She was not the most decorated. She was not the one who told stories in the ready room and after missions or held court at the corner table in the mess hall. She was the one other pilots watched when they thought she wasn't looking. The one the maintenance crew treated with a quiet, careful respect, not the admiring respect of fans, but the respect of people who understood that what they were seeing was something rare and perhaps a little dangerous to stand too close to. And she carried in the left chest pocket of her flight suit a folded card not much larger than a business card. White worn at the corners, creased down the middle from being opened and refolded hundreds of times. 3 names, written in her own handwriting, in ink that had faded from black to a dusty gray over 18 months of being pressed against her chest through every flight. She had never shown it to anyone. She never spoke about it. But the men and women who flew with her noticed that before every single mission, at some point during the pre-flight sequence, her right hand would move to that left pocket. Just for a moment. Just a touch. Like a man checking that his wallet is still there. Like a woman reminding herself of something she could never afford to forget. Bozeman, Montana sits at the edge of the Gallatin Valley, where the mountains come down hard and close, and the sky in winter turns a shade of blue so deep it looks painted. It is not a place that produces many fighter pilots. It is a place that produces people who understand from childhood that the world does not arrange itself for your convenience, that weather comes when it wants, that equipment fails, that the difference between a good outcome and a catastrophe is often just the quality of your attention in the moment before everything changes. Kate Mercer grew up in a house on the eastern edge of town where the road turned to gravel. Her father, Warren Mercer, worked the mines outside Billings for 30 years. He drove 90 minutes each way 3 days a week, and on the days he was home, he moved through the house with the economy of a man who had learned that energy spent on anything unnecessary is energy that isn't there when you need it. He was not cold. He was precise. He could diagnose a failing engine by the sound it made it idle. He could look at a stretch of mountain terrain and tell you within minutes where the water would run when the snow melted. He taught Kate one thing above all others. Machines talk. You have to be quiet enough to listen. Her mother, Elaine Mercer, had done 2 tours as a combat nurse in theaters that history would later describe in careful, sanitized language. She came home with both her hands intact and a reputation among the nurses she had worked with as the calmest person in any room where things were going badly wrong. She never raised her voice. She never panicked. She had told Kate something once sitting at the kitchen table with the mountains visible through the window and snow coming down outside that Kate had not fully understood until she was old enough to have made mistakes of her own. She said it the way she said everything important quietly without drama, as if she were stating a fact about weather. You can follow every rule and still lose people. When that happens, you don't get to grieve the rule. You only get to grieve the people. Kate had been 17. She had written it down when she got to her room. She had forgotten about it for years. It came back to her with considerable force on the morning after her first combat loss. She was 22 when she first climbed into the cockpit of an A-10 Thunderbolt II and understood at a cellular level that she had found the exact right machine for what she was built to do. The Warthog, as every pilot who flew it called it, as every soldier who had ever heard its cannon arrive overhead called it, was not elegant. It was not fast by the standards of modern combat aircraft. It was not glamorous. It was built around a gun. A 7-barrel rotary cannon running through the center of the aircraft like a spine capable of putting 65 armor-piercing rounds down free range every single second. The engines existed to carry the gun. The wings existed to keep the gun airborne. The titanium bathtub surrounding the cockpit existed to keep the pilot alive long enough to bring the gun back for another pass. Kate logged over 800 combat hours in 6 years, 3 deployments to regions that appeared on no public map. She flew in weather that grounded other aircraft over terrain that navigation systems called uncharted in support of ground units, who sometimes didn't know her name until after she had already changed the outcome of their day. She was good. She was very good. And then 18 months before the mission that would define everything else, she made a decision that she had not stopped remaking and unmaking and remaking every night since. It had been a morning in early autumn. The light was thin, and the mountains below carried their first snow at elevation. Kate was on her second sortie of the day monitoring a sector where a Ranger element, 12 men call sign Whetstone 3, had been conducting a movement to contact. She was orbiting at altitude, watching the terrain, her targeting pod painting the ground below in the clean digital clarity of the lightning system. The contact came fast. Too fast. Whetstone 3 walked into an ambush that had been set with precision and patience, positions dug in on elevated ground, interlocking fields of fire, a funnel of terrain that left the Rangers almost nowhere to move. The call for close air support came within 90 seconds of the first shots. Kate listened to the controller on the ground work through his request. She looked at the terrain. She ran the numbers. The enemy positions were on a ridgeline that rose steeply on both sides, and the geometry of an attack run that would put her ordnance precisely on target without endangering friendly positions required her to come in low. Lower than the standard safety parameters for that terrain type. Lower than the manual said was acceptable. The manual existed for good reasons. The manual had been written by people who had studied many missions and many failures and many deaths, and the numbers in it were not arbitrary. They were the distilled cost of hard lessons. Kate flew the attack from altitude. She released at the prescribed parameters. The ordnance hit within acceptable range of the target. In the language of the after-action report, the strike was assessed as effective. 3 Rangers died. 2 of them from fire that continued after Kate's strike from positions that a lower, closer run might have reached. The 3rd from a casualty delay that a more immediately suppressive attack pattern might have shortened. There was no finding against Kate Mercer. The board review confirmed she had followed procedure. Her commanding officer, Colonel Vivian Stokes, sat across from her in a small office and told her in measured words that she had done everything correctly. Kate sat with her hands folded on the table and said nothing. That night, she wrote 3 names on a white card. She folded it once. She put it in the left chest pocket of her flight suit. She never removed it permanently. Not once in the 18 months that followed. And she became, in the estimation of the people who flew alongside her, a noticeably more careful pilot, more conservative in her approach parameters, more precise in her compliance with standing operating procedures. She was not less skilled, if anything more technically polished. But the word that started appearing in informal conversations about her, the word that never made it into any official evaluation, was cautious. For a pilot in the culture of combat aviation, cautious is not entirely a compliment. It means something more complicated than careful. It means the kind of careful that sometimes at the wrong moment costs you the thing you were trying to protect. The morning of the mission was the 3rd consecutive day of patrol sorties over a sector of mountains that appeared on classified charts as a gray area territory where standard navigation databases offered nothing useful, where the terrain had been assessed from satellite imagery but never mapped at the level of detail that would make a pilot comfortable. Jagged ridges, deep ravines, valley systems that twisted and narrowed without warning, country that swallowed armies and gave nothing back. Kate had been up before dawn. She walked the flight line in the blue pre-dawn light, moving along the length of her A-10 with the attention of someone who has learned that the time you skip the pre-flight is the time the machine has something to tell you. Master Sergeant Glenn Hartwell, her crew chief, met her at the nose. Hartwell was 44 years old, built like a man who had spent 2 decades lifting things heavier than most people ever touched. And he communicated primarily through positioning. He would stand near a part of the aircraft he wanted you to examine and wait for you to examine it rather than pointing and explaining. He stood near the left engine housing for a long moment before walking away. Kate looked at the housing, ran her fingers along the panel seam. Everything correct. Hartwell reappeared beside her. Good to go, Captain. 3 words. From Hartwell, that was a speech. Kate nodded once and climbed the boarding ladder. At altitude with the sun fully up and the mountains spreading below her like a crumpled piece of paper thrown down by something enormous, she flew the assigned sector. Her fuel state was tracking toward bingo, the hard minimum for a safe return to base when she heard the call. It came through on the guard frequency, the channel every aircraft monitored, the channel you used when there was no time to find the right frequency because people were dying right now, and you needed anyone with wings. The voice was measured and flat, with the compressed cadence of a man who had been in enough bad situations to know that panic spent energy you needed for other things. Any aircraft, any aircraft. This is SEAL Element Trident 11. We are surrounded by approximately 200 hostile fighters. Grid is classified. We have 4 casualties, 2 critical. Ammunition critically low, requesting immediate close air support. I say again, immediate CAS or we are finished. And then in the space between transmissions, the background, gunfire explosions, men's voices calling distances and directions and casualty counts in the compressed language of people who are running out of time. Kate looked at her fuel gauge. 12 minutes to bingo. She looked at her moving map. The signal had originated from 40 miles northeast, through terrain that no sensible fixed-wing pilot would choose at low altitude. 4 minutes of flight time for an A-10 at cruise. That left 8 minutes. 8 minutes to change what was about to happen to 12 men in an unnamed valley. She reached up and touched the left chest pocket of her flight suit. Just for a moment, her fingers found the shape of the folded card through the fabric. 3 names. She thought about a morning 18 months ago. She thought about what it had felt like to land and walk into the debrief and listen to the words effective and within parameters and correct procedure, and to understand at some level below language that correct procedure had not been enough. The mountains spread below her, jagged and indifferent and vast. She made her decision before she had fully finished thinking about it, which was she would later understand exactly the point. Her mother had said years ago that you had to decide who you were before the moment arrived, because once it arrived, you didn't decide. You just were. Trident 11, this is Hog 27. I copy your call for close air support. I am 4 minutes out. State your condition. The reply came back fast. The relief in the voice was not dramatic. The man was too controlled for that, but it was there underneath the clipped radio language. Hog 27 Trident 11. We are pinned in a narrow valley, approximately 200 meters long by 50 meters wide. Hostile elements pressing from 3 sides, east, west, and south. Northern side sealed by a vertical cliff face. We count approximately 200 fighters, RPGs, and 50 caliber weapons in evidence. 4 casualties, 2 critical. Ammunition fewer than 100 rounds total. We need you now. Kate was already pushing the nose down, trading altitude for speed, her eyes moving across the instrument panel in the rapid scanning pattern that 6 years had made automatic airspeed altitude, fuel weapon status and navigation back to airspeed, always back to airspeed. She keyed the Air Operations Center. Ares Control, this is Hog 27, responding to troops in contact unmapped Valley Grid Northeast Sector, requesting immediate clearance for danger, close fire support. Be advised, I am at 12 minutes to bingo. The voice of Ares Control carried the weight of someone running their own calculations. Hog 27, Ares Control. That valley is unmapped with severe terrain hazards. You are cleared hot. Bingo is absolute. Finish quick. Roger Ares, diving in. She dropped through 20,000 feet. Through 15. The mountains rose toward her as she descended the scale of the terrain, shifting from abstract map features to something immediate: ridgelines with actual edges, valleys with actual floors, rock formations with shadows falling off their faces in the morning light. She had flown over terrain like this before. She had never flown through it. The difference was not technical. Flying over terrain, you are above it. It is something to be observed and navigated around. Flying through terrain at low altitude in a valley, the charts called uncharted, the relationship inverts. The terrain is no longer below you. It is all around you. It is the environment you are moving inside of. And it does not care whether you survive. She spotted the orange smoke from 18,000 feet. A thin column rising from a valley so narrow it looked like a crack in the earth, wedged between peaks that had no names on any chart, surrounded by ridgelines rising hundreds of feet on every side. The math organized itself in her mind the way it always did, not as conscious calculation, but as spatial understanding built from 6 years in this specific machine. 3 ridgelines, 3 attack runs, 12 minutes of fuel minus 4 minutes of transit equaled 8 minutes of work. Targeting pod active. Ammunition 1,174 rounds of armor-piercing incendiary in the G. A-8 drum. Eastern ridge first clear the most immediate pressure, give the SEALs room. Then west, then south. She was 4 minutes out when she reached into that chest pocket again. She unfolded the card with one hand, the other on the stick, and looked at it. Not reading the names, she knew the names, had known them every day for 18 months, but looking at the handwriting, the shape of letters written at 2 in the morning, while outside the window, the mountains were dark and the only sound was wind. She had made a promise to herself the night she wrote those names. She had thought it meant something about precision, about technical excellence, about being better at putting ordnance on target from correct parameters. She understood now that the promise had never been about parameters. It had been about not letting the distance between her and the ground become a form of safety she hid inside. She folded the card, returned it to her pocket. 4 minutes. The mountains came up on both sides. The valley revealed itself by degrees, first as a shape and terrain, then as a specific geography, then as a place where human beings were fighting right now, this second while she was still in the air above it. She could see the muzzle flashes on the eastern ridge. Small orange blooms against gray rock, rhythmic and relentless, pouring fire into the valley floor below. She could see on the western ridge the heavier signature of crew-served weapons, the distinctive cadence of a .50 caliber, slow and deliberate. Trident 11 Hog 27. I have tally on your smoke. 30 seconds out. Get your people as low and covered as possible. Striking eastern ridge first. Hog 27 Trident 11. Copy. We are flat on the deck. You are cleared hot. The valley opened below her like a mouth. And Captain Kate Mercer, 28 years old, 12 minutes of fuel in the tanks, and 3 names folded against her chest, pushed the A-10 into its dive and flew into the only place she had ever found, where everything she carried finally briefly made complete sense. The mountains came up on both sides. The ridgelines rose. The valley narrowed. The altimeter unwound toward numbers that would have made every instructor she had ever trained under reach for the radio. This was what the machine was built for. This was what she was built for. The gun was waiting. The eastern ridge filled her canopy at 4,000 feet. She had dropped from her approach altitude in a controlled dive that the A-10's airframe absorbed with the solidity of an aircraft designed not for elegance, but for endurance. The Warthog did not slice through air. It pushed through it. There was weight in every maneuver, a physical presence in the controls that other aircraft didn't carry, and in that weight was the information, the machine talking to the pilot through the stick and the rudder pedals, and the vibration traveling up through the seat, describing constantly what it was doing and what it was willing to do next. The valley was worse than it had looked from altitude. Terrain always was. Satellite imagery and classified charts gave you the shape of a place without the feel of it, the way the ridgelines leaned toward each other at the northern end, narrowing the sky to a strip barely wide enough for her wingspan. The rock columns jutting upward from the valley floor like teeth, irregular and unpredictable, appearing in her peripheral vision and disappearing before she could fully register them. The light falling differently at low altitude, shadows deep and misleading, wild between sunlit rock faces and shaded ravines, playing tricks on depth perception in ways that no instrument training fully compensated for. 200 milliseconds to process each piece of information, another 200 to act. At 350 knots, that was the arithmetic. Everything else was a variable. The math of reaction time was not. She locked the eastern ridge in the targeting reticle and squeezed the trigger. The GAU-8 came to life. There is no sound in combat aviation quite like the A-10's cannon firing at low altitude in an enclosed terrain environment. It is not a sound so much as a physical event, a hammering vibration that travels through the airframe and into the pilot's body, a tonal roar that ground troops have described as the sound of the earth itself tearing open. 65 rounds per second, each one the size of a wine bottle, each carrying a depleted uranium penetrator capable of punching through armor plates, screaming down range at nearly a mile per second. Kate held the trigger for 3 seconds. 195 rounds. The eastern ridge came apart. Positions that had been pouring fire into the valley simply ceased to exist. Rock faces splintering. Weapon systems disappearing in flashes of light and debris. The patient, methodical pressure that had been pinning Calloway's team to the ground interrupted suddenly and completely by a force that arrived with no warning and gave no quarter. She was already pulling the stick back before the smoke cleared, G-forces pressing her down into the seat as the Warthog climbed out of the attack valley walls, falling away as she gained altitude and banked left to set up the second pass. Hog 27, Trident 11. Direct hits on the eastern ridge. They are breaking on that side. Can you hit the west of Roger Trident? Swinging around now, she rolled the aircraft into a tight left bank, repositioning for the western ridge. The fuel gauge told her she had used 90 seconds of her window. 6 minutes and 30 seconds remaining. The western ridge was tighter, closer to the SEAL position, less room between friendly forces and enemy fighting positions. The geometry of a safe attack run required a more acute approach angle, which meant longer exposure to the ridge during the run and less time to clear terrain on exit. She was calculating the approach when the targeting pod screen went dark. Not flickered, not degraded. Dark. A flat black rectangle where the light-tending display had been with a single amber fault light in the lower left corner. Kate looked at the fault light for exactly 1 second. Then she looked out the canopy. The lightning pod was the aircraft's precision eye, its ability to see targets at distance, identify friendly positions, aim with accuracy that kept close air support from becoming close air catastrophe. Without it, she was flying on optical sight and pilot judgment, which meant closer approach, longer target identification, and more time in the threat envelope of whatever was waiting on those ridges. The manual had a clear, unambiguous position on continuing close air support operations following a targeting system failure over complex terrain. Kate keyed the radio. Trident 11 Hog 27. Be advised I have a targeting system malfunction. Continuing the mission on visual. I need your exact position relative to the western ridge. Distance and bearing. A pause. Then Callaway, the calculation evident even through radio compression. Hog 27 Trident 11. We are approximately 80 meters south of the western ridge base. Ridge runs east-west. Enemy positions concentrated on the upper third western half. Our people are low and covered. 80 meters. Without the targeting pod at the altitude she needed to make a visual identification run, 80 meters between friendly forces, and her aim point was not within standard safety margins for visual close air support. By the numbers, the doctrine said, abort and re-coordinate. Kate came around to the western ridge approach and pushed the nose down. She went lower than the first run. Without the pod, she needed to see the ridge face directly identify weapon positions visually before engaging. That meant descending past the point where the number said she should be into the band of air, where rock columns and valley walls were no longer background features, but immediate threats requiring constant active management. 1,500 feet above the valley floor. The western ridge resolved from a general shape into specific topography, crevices and ledges, and fighting positions cut or piled by human hands. Weapon systems visible to the naked eye at this altitude. She squeezed the trigger. 3 seconds, 195 rounds. The western ridge lit up in a sequence of impacts that traveled along the rock face from west to east, each shell detonating on contact, the chain of explosions catching something stored there. Ammunition or fuel that went up in a secondary blast, expanding outward and upward, turning the upper third of the ridge into a wall of fire and debris. Direct impact, Hog. You just silenced their heavy weapons on the west. But most of them are massed on the southern side. That is where the main force is. Kate pulled off the target and climbed. She checked the fuel. 4 minutes and 40 seconds, 1 ridge remaining. She was working the geometry of the southern approach when Callaway's voice returned, carrying something different in it, a tightness that had not been there before. Hog 27, one more thing before your last run. We just observed 2 men set up a tube system on the southern ridge eastern end. They moved into cover after placing it. They were there before you arrived. Kate processed that. A tube system, 2 men, in a prepared position, already in place before the engagement began. She keyed back. Trident 11, can you confirm they were in position prior to your contact? Affirmative, Hog. We think they were waiting. Waiting. The word carried weight that the tactical picture had not fully revealed until this moment. Waiting implied foreknowledge. Waiting implied that someone in that valley had known before the first shots were fired that a ground element in this terrain would call for air support. That air support would arrive as fixed-wing aircraft, and that fixed-wing aircraft in a valley this narrow would have limited approach options. The ambush had not been set only for 12 Navy SEALs. It had been set for 12 Navy SEALs and whatever came to save them. Kate flew a long arc above the valley while she thought about that. Below her, 2 ridges were burning. Below her, 12 men were low and covered and still alive because she had come when they called. Below her on the southern ridge, a man-portable air defense system, she was nearly certain, that's what it was, waited in a prepared position for her to commit to an attack run that left her almost no options for evasion. 4 minutes of fuel remaining. She could break off, enough fuel to return to base. Two attack runs completed enemy force significantly degraded Calloway's team with a fighting chance to maneuver. There was a legitimate technical argument that the mission had achieved enough. She thought about making that argument. She thought about 18 months ago and the debrief and the words correct procedure and the three names on the card in her chest pocket. She was not going to make that argument. Trident 11 Hog 27, I have 4 minutes of fuel, making one final pass on the southern ridge. After that, I am forced to break off. Get your people as far north as the terrain allows. Copy Hog 27. Southern ridge is their stronghold. Break them there, and we fight our way out. A pause, then Calloway again, the radio discipline, thinned by something that had no operational name. We hear you up there. We know what you're doing. Kate did not respond. There was nothing useful to say, and there was no time. She began her approach. The southern ridge required something the training manuals had never described, and no instructor had walked a student through because the scenario it required was one that doctrine said should not exist. The geometry of the valley, the position of friendly forces, the prepared launcher on the eastern end of the ridge, and the fuel remaining all pointed toward the same conclusion. She was going to fly into the valley. Not over it, not along its edge. Into it. From the north at low altitude, using the valley floor itself as her approach corridor, staying below the effective engagement envelope of the launcher by presenting an angle so acute that the system couldn't develop a firing solution against an aircraft moving at this speed through terrain this narrow. The A-10's minimum safe operating altitude over complex terrain was 500 feet. The valley floor along her intended approach would put her at less than 300. Her wingspan was 57 feet. The valley at its narrowest point in the approach corridor was approximately 60 meters, roughly 200 feet wide. She did not think about the math once she committed. Thinking about the math was a way of thinking about the walls. Thinking about the walls was a way of dying. She pushed the nose down and flew into the valley. 350 knots. 280 feet above the valley floor, rock walls rising on both sides. The sky narrowed to a strip of blue above her. The terrain ahead twisted left, and she banked left hard, the Warthog's wings moving through air that felt inches from the stone faces on either side. Then the valley twisted right, and she banked right, and the altimeter alarm started its flat, insistent tone because she was below every parameter it had been programmed to consider survivable. She turned the alarm off, not because she didn't hear it, because she needed to hear other things. The engine note, the airframe, the quality of air moving over the control surfaces, the information the machine was feeding her through the stick and the rudder pedals, the constant conversation between pilot and aircraft that her father had taught her to listen for before she ever flew anything back in a garage in Bozeman, where he diagnosed failing equipment by sound alone. The valley twisted once more and then opened, not wide, not suddenly, but enough. The southern ridge appeared ahead at a range that would have been suicidal from a conventional approach, and was from this angle exactly what she needed. She was looking up at it from below. Inside its minimum engagement range, moving at 4 miles per minute, giving the defenders on that ridge perhaps half a second to register what was happening. They had not planned for this. Nobody had planned for this. Kate leveled the nose, squeezed the trigger. 3 bursts, 3 seconds each, 600 rounds. The cannon worked across the southern face from east to west with the systematic precision of something that could not be argued with each shell, finding the positions prepared there, the bunkers and fighting holes and crew-served weapons, and the men behind them. Secondary explosions rolled up the ridge in sequence as stored ammunition cooked off. The launcher position on the eastern end, she found it on her 3rd burst, put 40 rounds into the prepared position, and it stopped tracking. She pulled the stick back. The Warthog came off the target, and the valley walls fell away as she climbed, and for 2 seconds, 3 seconds, she was simply flying, ascending the aircraft, responding, everything working. And then the tail moved in a way it should not have moved. A slight yaw to the left that was not quite what her rudder inputs should have produced. A vibration in the control surface, feedback high frequency not present before. She corrected automatically the correction larger than usual to achieve the same result. She looked at the instrument panel. Hydraulic pressure on the left control surface circuit was lower than normal. Not in the red, not amber, but moving in a direction she didn't like. She ran a quick systems check. Nothing flagged as critical. The aircraft was flying. The aircraft would continue flying. She made a note of it and turned north. Below her, the southern ridge was burning. Trident 11 Hog 27, I am Winchester on gun. Bingo on fuel. Breaking off now. Can your element move? The reply took 4 seconds. When Calloway's voice came back, the radio discipline was gone entirely. What was underneath was not dramatic. It was simply true. Hog 27, you just saved 12 lives. All three ridges are silent. Enemy is in retreat on every side. We are moving now. We are going to make it out because of what you just did. A pause. I don't know who you are. But we know your call sign now. We are not going to forget it. Kate set the aircraft on a heading for base and climbed. The mountains fell away beneath her. The sky opened. The fuel gauge showed what it showed, and she calculated her margins, and they were thin but present. She did not respond to Calloway's transmission. There were no words that were the right size for that moment. She flew north with a hydraulic system reading she would have to report to Hartwell, and 8 minutes of flight time back to a runway she had not been certain 40 minutes ago she would ever see again. The Warthog flew steadily beneath her hands. Below, in a valley without a designation on any chart, 12 men were moving toward an extraction point, moving upright on their own legs in the direction of safety. Moving because someone had come all the way down into the place they were trapped and had not left until the work was finished. Kate kept her eyes on the instruments. She thought about her mother's voice, about a kitchen table in Bozeman and mountains visible through the window and snow coming down and words said without drama as statement of fact. You can follow every rule and still lose people. When that happens, you don't get to grieve the rule. You only get to grieve the people. The fuel gauge moved. The sky ahead was clear and very blue. She flew home. She touched down with 1 minute and 40 seconds of fuel remaining. Not approximately 2 minutes. 1 minute and 40 seconds confirmed by the gauge and confirmed again by Master Sergeant Glenn Hartwell when he pulled the post-flight data 20 minutes after she taxied to her spot on the flight line. He would tell her the number quietly standing beside the aircraft without looking at her. In the way he delivered information he thought a person needed time to absorb before responding. The landing itself was unremarkable. She would use that word in the debrief, and the intelligence officer across from her would write it down and look up with an expression suggesting he found the word choice interesting. Unremarkable. She had held the aircraft on centerline, managed the approach, speed touchdown within the first third of the runway. The Warthog had handled normally throughout. The hydraulic anomaly she had noted during egress presenting no operational difficulty during the landing sequence. Unremarkable. What was not unremarkable was what Hartwell found 4 minutes after Kate climbed out of the cockpit. She was still on the flight line, helmet in hand, running through the mental inventory that combat pilots ran after every mission, whether they meant to or not, cataloging what had happened, sequencing it, filing it in the part of the brain that would process it later when the body had remembered how to be at rest. She was doing this automatically when she heard Hartwell's voice from the rear of the aircraft. He said one word, "Captain," not alarm, the tone of a man who has found something that requires another set of eyes immediately and has chosen the most precise way to communicate that requirement. Kate walked to the rear of the aircraft. Hartwell was standing beside the left horizontal stabilizer, looking at the control surface attachment point. Not touching it, looking at it the way her father had looked at failed equipment, with the focused attention of someone making an inventory and working backward from evidence to understand cause. Kate looked at where he was looking. The attachment bracket for the left stabilizer was cracked along its upper surface, not broken. Cracked, a fracture running approximately 4 inches through the metal, deep enough that in the right light, you could see it had propagated most of the way through the bracket's load-bearing cross-section. The surface around the crack showed stress marks consistent with a sudden high-load event, not metal fatigue from gradual wear. A single moment of force at a magnitude the bracket was not designed to absorb. If Kate had pulled the aircraft 2 degrees steeper in her exit from the southern ridge attack, the load on that bracket would have exceeded its remaining structural capacity. The stabilizer would have departed the aircraft. An A-10 without a left horizontal stabilizer does not fly. It does not glide. It transitions very quickly from a controlled aircraft to an uncontrolled object, subject only to physics, which are not interested in outcomes, only in forces. Kate stood beside Hartwell and looked at the cracked bracket for a long moment. Hartwell said nothing. He understood she was running her own version of the numbers, arriving at her own understanding of what the distance between what had happened and what had almost happened actually measured. She said, "Get it documented. Full structural assessment." "Already called it in," Hartwell said. Then after a pause almost imperceptible in length, "Good flight, Captain." From Hartwell at that moment, standing beside that crack, those 3 words were not a routine sign-off. Kate heard what they were. She nodded once and walked toward the operations building. Colonel Vivian Stokes found her 20 minutes later. Stokes was 51 years old with close-cropped silver hair and the bearing of someone who had been making difficult decisions in difficult environments for so long that difficulty had simply become the texture of her professional life. She was not a warm commanding officer in the conventional sense. She was a precise one, which Kate had always found more useful. Precision in a commanding officer meant you knew where you stood. You knew what was being asked. You knew when something went wrong, what the accounting would look like. She stood in the doorway of the operations room and looked at Kate for a moment. "The SEALs are here," she said. "They're asking to see you." They were standing near the edge of the flight line, 12 of them still carrying their gear, still wearing the residue of a close thing, the accumulated dust and exertion, and something in the eyes that Kate recognized from her own reflection on the worst days. The look of people who have been very close to a door that only opens one way and have come back to find the world still ordinary and inexplicably full of light. The man at the front was Lieutenant Commander Rhett Calloway. He was 36 years old, solidly built, the kind of solid that came from years of carrying weight over long distances rather than from a weight room. He had dark eyes, and when he looked at Kate, he did so with a directness that was not aggressive, but simply clear, the gaze of a man who had decided in the past several hours exactly what he thought about the person in front of him. He extended his hand. "Lieutenant Commander Rhett Calloway, my men wanted to meet you." Kate shook his hand. "Captain Kate Mercer." "We know," said one of the men behind Calloway. His name tape read Weston. "We've been saying it on the radio for the past hour." Calloway looked at her steadily. "We listened to everything on the net, all 3 runs. We heard you flying that valley at under 300 feet. We could hear your engines off the rock walls from the ground." He paused. "I've worked with every kind of air support over 12 years. Fast movers, rotary-armed drones, B-52 carpets. I have never heard anything like what you did in that valley." Another man stepped forward. Name tape read Aldrich. He was younger than Calloway, with the stillness of someone who had recently been in a situation that had clarified his thinking considerably. "Ma'am, when the ambush hit, we ran the numbers. 200 fighters, 3 enclosed ridges, 4 casualties, 80 rounds between 12 men. We'd been in bad spots before. This was different. This was a box with no exit." He stopped. Then your voice came over the guard frequency. Kate did not say anything. She was watching Calloway, watching something in his posture that suggested he was working up to the point of the conversation. He reached into a pocket on his chest rig and produced a trident pin. Gold heavy, the anchor and eagle and pistol of naval special warfare pressed into metal with the authority of a symbol that carried weight because of what it had cost the people who wore it. "This is from my team," Calloway said. "All 12 of us. We want you to have it." Kate looked at it. "I'm not a SEAL," she said. "I didn't earn that." "No," Calloway said. "You earned something else. You earned the right to have us give it to you." He held her gaze. "Take it, Captain." She took it. It was heavier than it looked. She stood with it in her palm, and without fully intending to, her right hand moved to her left chest pocket. She felt the shape of the folded card through the fabric, and she thought about 3 names in fading ink, and for the first time in 18 months, the weight of that card did not feel like a verdict. It felt like a reason. "One more thing," Calloway said. His posture had settled as if he had finished the calculation he'd been running. "The guys talked on the extraction. All the way out, while we were moving, we were trying to find the right word for what you did." He looked at her. "We settled on a call sign." Behind him, Weston said it first. Then the others, one by one, until all 12 of them had said it, and it had become in that moment on the flight line something that could not be unsaid. "Valkyrie." Kate stood in the afternoon sun and held the trident pin and heard her call sign for the first time from the mouths of 12 men who had been prepared to die 4 hours ago and were standing here breathing because of 8 minutes of work. Colonel Stokes was standing 20 feet away watching. Kate did not look at her, but she could feel the weight of her commanding officer's attention, the way you feel the sun on your back when the air is cold warmth that carries both comfort and consequence. She did not know in that moment that the consequence was already in motion. She would find out the following morning. General Nadine Crowley arrived at the base before 700. Kate was summoned at 7:30 before she had finished her coffee, before the debrief she had expected to begin at 800 had started. The runner who came for her was professionally neutral in expression, which was itself information. Runners fetching officers for routine debriefs wore their boredom openly. This one was not bored. Kate followed him to Stokes' office, where Stokes was standing rather than sitting, and where behind the desk General Nadine Crowley occupied the chair with the stillness of a great deal of controlled energy directed entirely inward. Crowley was 58 years old. She had commanded fighter wings, joint task forces, in operational environments that do not appear in public reporting. Her record was the kind that became partly legendary and partly cautionary, not because she had done things wrong, but because she had done things right in ways that made other people's careful calculations look insufficient. She looked at Kate for a moment after Kate entered and came to attention. "Sit down, Captain." Kate sat. "I've read the post-flight report, reviewed the gun camera footage, spoken with the SEAL Element commander and with Colonel Stokes." Crowley placed her hands flat on the desk. "I also spoke this morning at 0545 with Brigadier General Howard Lyle." The name arrived in the room with a weight that suggested Stokes had been expecting it. "General Lyle commands this operational sector. He has significant concerns about the regulatory violations involved in yesterday's mission and about the broader implications of the mission becoming part of the public record." Kate said nothing. "The SEAL Element you supported was operating under a Special Activities Authority not reflected in standard operational documentation for this sector." Crowley's voice was level and without inflection. "General Lyle's position is that if yesterday's events become the subject of any formal recognition, commendation, or public discussion, the operational framework that authorized Callaway's element becomes visible in ways that create significant problems for ongoing activities in this theater." She paused. "His recommendation to my headquarters was that the incident be documented as a routine close air support mission, that no special recognition be awarded, and that you be formally counseled for the 17 procedural violations identified in your post-flight data." The room was quiet. Kate looked at Crowley and waited. "I declined that recommendation." Crowley's tone did not change. "I declined it because it was operationally dishonest and unjust, and because the Air Force does not counsel pilots for saving 12 lives with 8 minutes of fuel in a broken targeting system." She let a beat pass. "However, General Lyle is not wrong that the operational exposure is real. The full incident report, including gun camera footage, the structural assessment of your aircraft, and all related communications will be classified at a level preventing public disclosure for 10 years. The citation will describe the conduct without specifying operational context. The ceremony will be private, no media, no family notification through official channels." Another pause. "You will be awarded the Air Force Cross. You will be promoted to Major effective today. And you will be reassigned to the A-10 Weapons School at Nellis, where you will train the next generation of close air support pilots." Kate absorbed all of this. She thought about a ceremony without her father, who had taught her to listen to machines, without her mother, who had told her that rules were not always sufficient, without anyone from outside this base who would know what the medal meant because they knew what the mission had cost. She thought about 10 years of silence. She thought about Callaway and his men on the flight line in the afternoon sun, and the pin sitting on the shelf above her bunk, and the call sign that would travel through the special operations community by channels no classification order could touch. She thought about all of it, and then she said, "Understood, General." Crowley looked at her for a moment longer than the response required. Then she stood, and something in her bearing shifted, not warmer exactly, but less institutional, the way a person moves when they step briefly outside the frame of the official exchange they have just completed. She moved toward the door. "Congratulations, Major." The ceremony was held in a room that fit 30 people and had 30 people in it. No reporters, no photographers beyond the official base photographer, whose images would be archived at the classification level of the incident report. No family. Stokes had offered to place the call to Bozeman, and Kate had declined quietly and without explanation, and Stokes, to her credit, had not pressed it. Crowley read the citation herself. She read it in the flat, measured cadence of official military language, which strips the color from events and reduces them to operational facts, altitudes and distances, and ammunition expenditures, and enemy force assessments. And in doing so, sometimes, not always, but sometimes makes the events more rather than less extraordinary, because the gap between what the language describes and what the language cannot describe becomes its own kind of statement. Kate stood at attention and listened to a description of what she had done that was accurate in every particular, and that felt somehow like a description seen from a great distance. The 8 minutes in the valley were not in the language of the citation. The hydraulic crack was not there. The 3 names on the card in her chest pocket were not there. What was there was enough. Crowley pinned the Air Force Cross to Kate's uniform. Then the oak leaves of a major. She stepped back and looked at Kate for a moment, and Kate thought she saw in the general's expression something that was not quite satisfaction, something more complicated, the expression of a person who has done the right thing within an imperfect system and is clear-eyed about both the rightness and the imperfection. Combat aviators do not erupt. They applauded with the restrained precision of professionals who understood the weight of what they were applauding and found that weight more appropriately honored by understatement than by noise. Calloway and 3 members of his team had been permitted to attend. They stood at the back of the room in their working uniforms, and they did not applaud. They stood at attention, which in the context was the higher honor. After the ceremony in the hallway, Calloway found her. He said nothing for a moment. Then 10 years is a long time. Yes, Kate said. Doesn't change what happened in that valley. No, it doesn't. He nodded once. Then the call sign travels major. Classification doesn't cover that. She understood what he meant. In the networks connecting special operations personnel, the informal channels that move faster than any official messaging system, what had happened in that valley would be known. Not in specifics, not in ways that expose the operational framework, but known as a fact about what a specific pilot had been willing to do when 12 men needed her to be willing. Kate thought about that as she walked back to her quarters, about reputation and record and the difference between what was documented and what was true. She took the card from her chest pocket, sat on the edge of her bunk, held it. 3 names, the ink paler now than when she had written it, the creases deep from 18 months of folding and unfolding. She did not unfold it this time. She just held it, feeling the familiar weight and shape of it, thinking about what it had meant to carry it and what it meant now and whether those were the same thing. She decided they were not. The card had started as a verdict. It had become somewhere over a valley that had no name, something else. Not absolution she did not believe in. Absolution did not think the ledger worked that way, did not think you could balance one set of names against another and arrive at a sum that meant you were done accounting. Evidence, maybe. Evidence that the question she had been carrying for 18 months was not a question about whether she had done the right thing on that autumn morning. It was a question about who she was going to be every morning after it. And she had answered that question definitively in 8 minutes of work in the worst terrain she had ever flown, with a broken targeting system and a hydraulic bracket that was 4 inches of metal from killing her. She had answered it by going all the way down. She put the card back in her pocket. 5 years later at Nellis Air Force Base, Nevada Major Kate Mercer stood at the front of a classroom and watched her own gun camera footage on the screen behind her. The pilots in the room were not students in the conventional sense. They were experienced combat aviators, most with significant operational time selected for the A-10 weapons school because they had demonstrated a level of proficiency worth developing further. They would leave as weapons officers, the senior close air support instructors of the force, the people who would shape how the next decade of Warthog pilots thought about the mission. They watched the footage from the valley in silence. The footage had been partially declassified 18 months earlier, 4 years ahead of the original 10-year restriction under a policy review that Crowley, now a 3-star, had initiated and pushed through over the residual objections of people in operational commands who preferred not to deal with the precedent it created. Crowley had dealt with those objections by being more right and more senior than the people making them, and had proceeded. The footage was 43 seconds long. It showed the approach to the southern ridge from inside the valley, the rock walls moving past the camera at a speed that made several pilots in the room lean slightly forward in their chairs without appearing to notice they had done so. It showed 3 bursts. It showed the exit. It ended. Kate let the room be quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Everything you just watched is outside standard operating parameters for close air support in complex terrain. The altitude, the approach vector, the proximity to friendly positions, the decision to continue following a targeting system failure. Every element of that run by the numbers in your pocket guides should not have happened." She looked at the room. The 12 members of the ground element are all currently alive and on active duty. A hand went up in the 3rd row. She had noticed this pilot from the first day of the course, Captain Everett Marsh, 29 years old, sandy-haired, lean, with eyes that were attentive in a way that was different from the rest of the class, more personal, as if the material was not just professionally relevant, but carried some private weight she had not yet identified. She had read every A-10 accident report from the past decade before her first year at Nellis. Not required, not recommended. What she did the week before each new cohort arrived, sat in her office with classified documents and read the specific technical language of what had gone wrong, thought about who had been in the cockpit, what they had known and not known in the last seconds before the knowing stopped mattering. She had read the report on Captain Alan Marsh's accident 7 years ago. She had thought about it. She was thinking about it now, looking at his son, who had his father's eyes and his father's way of holding his chin at a slight upward angle when working through something genuinely difficult. Marsh spoke. "Ma'am, with all due respect, The footage shows a pilot who survived a mission that the airframe data says should have killed her. The structural failure assessment found a bracket 4 inches from catastrophic failure. The hydraulic anomaly could have progressed to control surface loss on 3 separate occasions during egress. He paused. The outcome was extraordinary. But the outcome was also partly the result of factors outside the pilot's control. If that bracket fails, we are not having this conversation. If we teach this as a model, if we tell pilots this is what the mission demands and what they should be willing to do, we are not teaching them to save lives. We are teaching them to take risks that the numbers say end in a wreck more often than not. The room was very still. Kate looked at Marsh for a moment. She recognized the shape of what he was asking, had known its shape since before he walked into her classroom, since she read the document describing what had happened to his father in a mountain valley 7 years ago, a man who had also descended below minimum safe altitude in pursuit of a target solution and who had not come back. Everett Marsh was not asking a tactical question. He was asking whether his father had been brave or reckless, whether what had killed him was a virtue or a failure, whether the line between the two was something real or something instructors drew in classrooms to make the unanswerable seem answerable. Kate was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached into the left chest pocket of her flight suit. She took out the card, the edges soft with years of handling. The creases pressed so many times into the same patterns that the paper held them naturally the way old wood holds the shape of its grain. She unfolded it and laid it flat on the table in front of her. She did not turn it toward the class. She did not ask anyone to read it. She simply put it on the table where it was visible, where it existed as a fact in the room. 18 months before that mission, she said, I flew a close air support mission over difficult but manageable terrain. I followed every parameter. I maintained safe altitude. I released at the prescribed standoff distance. I violated no regulations and no procedures. She looked at the card. 3 Rangers died because the support they received was correct by the standards and insufficient for the situation. The room held its breath. I carried those names every day from that morning until the day I flew into that valley. She looked up, not at the room generally, at Marsh. You are right that I am alive, partly because a bracket held. I know that. I knew it the day Hartwell showed me the crack. I know it every time I run this footage. She paused. I am also alive because I knew my aircraft. Not from textbooks, from 800 hours in that specific machine, listening to what it told me through the stick and the pedals and the seat. I was not flying blind. I was flying at the edge of what I knew in a machine I had learned to hear. She let that sit. I read your father's accident report, she said. Her tone was not dramatic. It was the tone of someone placing a fact in the room that was better acknowledged than left to occupy the space unspoken. He was a skilled pilot. The board's findings describe what happened. They don't describe who he was or what he was trying to do. Those are different documents. One exists, one doesn't. That is one of the things that is wrong with how we account for these missions. Marsh said nothing, but the angle of his chin changed the particular adjustment of a person who has been holding something rigid for a long time and has just been given not permission exactly, but reason to consider releasing it. Kate picked up the card, did not refold it immediately, held it. I don't know if your father knew enough in that moment. I don't know if I knew enough. I know what the brackets said afterward. I know what those 12 men said on a flight line in the afternoon sun. And I know that 3 other men are not here because I stayed at a safe altitude. I cannot make those 2 facts into a formula that tells you what to do the next time you are 40 seconds from bingo over terrain that is trying to kill you. She folded the card, put it back in her pocket. That, she said, is what I am here to teach you. Not the answer, the weight of the question, because you are going to carry it every time you strap in. And the only thing worse than carrying it is believing you can set it down. Marsh sat back in his chair. He did not look away. His expression was not resolved. It was something that would take longer to understand and was more useful for that reason. Kate recognized it. She had learned over 5 years at Nellis to look for exactly that expression because it was the one that meant the lesson had landed somewhere below the level of notes. 3 weeks later, Kate was standing at the edge of the flight line watching a formation of 4 A-10s complete their pre-flight sequence when her radio crackled. Guard frequency, any aircraft, any aircraft. This is ground element Phantom 11. We have troops in contact elevated hostile positions complex terrain, requesting immediate close air support. She looked at the 4 aircraft. The lead aircraft was hers. A training sortie standard curriculum, low stakes, high procedural value. Formation tactics in controlled airspace, nothing more dramatic than that. The second aircraft was Marsh. She had cleared him to fly wing 2 days ago, his first operational formation flight of the weapons school curriculum. He had flown it the way he flew everything, with the kind of focused quiet that she had come to recognize as the external sign of someone doing serious internal work. She keyed her radio. Phantom 1-1, this is Hog Flight, Valkyrie led. Copy your call for close air support. We are 4 aircraft. State your position and condition. The response came back with coordinates and details and the tight controlled urgency she had heard once before in a different valley on a different day, with 12 minutes of fuel and 3 names in her pocket. She looked at the terrain unfolding on her moving map. Another valley, more ridgelines, country that the charts labeled complex terrain and that pilots learned when they got down into it was the closest thing to hostile the Earth itself could manage. She climbed into her aircraft. Marsh was already in his canopy, down visor-lowered engines at operating speed. She could see the shape of him in the cockpit, the helmet and oxygen mask and gloved hands moving through the pre-takeoff flow with the unhurried precision of someone who had internalized the sequence thoroughly enough that it required no conscious attention, which freed the conscious attention for everything else. She thought about a bracket, about a card with 3 names in fading zinc, about a classroom where she had laid something on a table that she could not take back and had not wanted to. She keyed the formation frequency. Valkyrie flight lead. Departure in sequence on my mark. Troops at contact 40 miles northeast. We have fuel. We have guns. A beat. 4 engines behind her. The runway ahead. The mountains in the middle distance carrying the first light of morning on their upper faces. Mark. The Warthog moved. Behind her 3 aircraft followed. Pilots she had trained. Pilots who had sat in her classroom and watched the footage and asked the hard questions and left with not an answers, but the weight of the questions, which was the only preparation that was honest. Marsh lifted off the runway 30 seconds behind her. She watched his aircraft until it was airborne and climbing, and then she looked forward into the blue toward a valley where a ground element was right now defending with whatever they had left while they waited for the sound that meant someone was coming. She did not think about the bracket. She did not think about the card. She did not think about the classroom or the years at Nellis, or the ceremony with no photographers, or what Crowley had chosen not to say when she had the words and chose the door instead. She thought about 40 miles, 4 minutes of flight, 8 minutes of work on the other side. She flew toward it the way she had always flown toward it, all the way forward, all the way down into the exact place where the mission was waiting, and the distance between safe and necessary had already been closed by someone else's need. The mountains rose beneath her. The sky at altitude was that particular shade of blue that existed nowhere on the ground, the color of distance, the color of everything the earth below could not reach. And somewhere in the valley ahead, closing fast now, the sound was already traveling, that low, unmistakable note that carried through mountains and across ridgelines and down into the places where men waited and listened and knew when they heard it that they were not alone. Valkyrie was on her way.